Everyone, I'm Elizabeth Buss, Editor-in-Chief of Disobedient Media, and I'm so glad that you joined us once again, and I'm going to read you one of our articles. And I always get questions about why it is that I'm not just discussing issues with you all. And the thing is that what I'm doing here with these videos, I know a lot of you know this already, but I want to explain one more time that the reason I do these videos is because I understand that there are those that for many reasons, whether it's limited time availability, whether it's not liking reading, whether it's even having learning disabilities, many people don't like or find it difficult to read articles that are published on Disobedient Media's website, and so I really wanted to make those articles accessible to those who, for whatever reason, don't like or can't read them. So, with that said, the article that I'm going to read for you all today is titled Opinion, Ecuador's Solitary Confinement of Assange is Torture. It's one that I've been posting every single day for the last week or so because of the importance of what's happening to Assange right now, and in hopes that it will help both raise awareness and hopefully, try to encourage a change in this horrible situation. So, it's it's an opinion piece, so bear in mind that as I read this to you that this is just my opinion. And so with that all out of the way, I'll just get started reading. I wrote, quote, solitary confinement is torture. It is torture when it is used in prisons against adults and teenagers like Khalif Browder. It was torture when it was imposed on Chelsea Manning. And it is torture that is now being applied to Wikileaks editor-in-chief Julian Assange. What exactly constitutes torture, and why does solitary confinement fall under this definition? The term is defined in the online English dictionary thus, quote, 1. The action or practice of inflicting severe pain on someone as a punishment or in order to force them to do or say something, e.g., the torture of political prisoners, or, example, confessions extracted under torture. 1.1, great physical or mental suffering, and 1.2, a cause of great physical or mental suffering. And that's the end of the definition from the Oxford English Dictionary. And clearly by this standard, Julian Assange is experiencing torture in the form of great mental and physical suffering stemming from his long-term, indefinite confinement without medical care, which is now exacerbated by Ecuador's imposition of near-complete social isolation. And Assange was already facing the beginning of his sixth year spent in arbitrary confinement in the Ecuadorian embassy in London before Ecuador's implementation of total isolation. The lengthy period of arbitrary confinement followed approximately 2 years under house arrest. WikiLeaks recently likened Assange's current circumstances to solitary confinement on Twitter, and then I embedded a quote from WikiLeaks saying that links an article, and it says, quote, in conversation with Julian Assange, parentheses, now in effective solitary confinement, parentheses, and then it links. That's the end of the tweet, which is embedded in the article, and I will include the link to this whole article in the description of this video, as I always do, as well as links on how you can help Julian Assange by donating, by buying from the WikiLeaks shop, and by signing petitions, which I will link, and everything like that I can. But continuing with the article, I wrote that Chelsea Manning has described her experience in solitary confinement in a 2016 opinion piece published with The Guardian. She said, quote, solitary confinement is no-touch torture and it must be abolished. Shortly after arriving at a makeshift military camp at Camp Arifjan, Kuwait, in May 2010, I was placed into the black hole of solitary confinement for the first time. Within 2 weeks, I was contemplating suicide. After a month on suicide watch, I was transferred back to the US to a tiny 6x8, roughly, which is 6 by 8 feet, which is roughly 2 by 2.5 meters, cell in a place that will haunt me for the rest of my life. The U.S. Marine Corps brig in Quantico, Virginia. I was held there for roughly 9 months as a prevention of injury prisoner, a designation that the Marine Corps and the Navy used to place me in highly restrictive solitary conditions without a psychiatrist's approval. And that's the end of the quote from Chelsea Manning's opinion piece in The Guardian. And she also, in that opinion piece, she also cited the sentiments of Juan Mendez in her op-ed, with Mendez acknowledging that the harmful effects of solitary confinement can become permanent after as little as 15 days, a length of time which, at the time of writing the article, Julian Assange had just eclipsed, but at the time of making this video, Assange has doubled that time in solitary confinement. He is, at the time of making this video, he will have been in solitary confinement for a month tomorrow. By the time this video is published, he will have been in solitary confinement for a full month. So, and I want to highlight the quote from Mendez in the article that the opinion piece by Chelsea Manning. And so Mendez said, quote, "Prolonged solitary confinement raises special concerns because the risk of grave and irreparable damage or harm to the detained person increases with the length of isolation and the uncertainty regarding its duration. In my public declarations on this theme, I have defined prolonged solitary confinement as any period in excess of 15 days. This definition reflects the fact that most of the scientific literature shows that after 15 days, certain changes in brain functions occur and the harmful physiological effects of isolation can become irreversible." And that is the end of the quote from Juan Mendez. The words of alleged Wikileaks source Chelsea Manning, who Wikileaks made strenuous efforts to protect from the moment of her 2010 arrest, are particularly poignant given Assange's current situation. Specifically, Wikileaks editor-in-chief is now subject to conditions similar to those imposed on Manning after her arrest for allegedly supplying the publisher with documentation of war crimes perpetrated by the US military. And even the horrors of normally hectic news cycles pale in comparison with the events of the last 2 weeks. The emergence of reports that Julian Assange had been silenced at the behest of the Ecuadorian government quickly gave rise to vigils, both on and offline, multiple petitions in his defense signed by tens of thousands, excuse me, as well as innumerable acts of solidarity. Sorry for my throat kind of breaking up there. It's allergy season, it's spring, so bear with me. But at the time of writing, Assange's contact with the outside world had not been restored despite the passage of 3 weeks. And at the time of making this video, has now been a month. So this time span may sound brief, but to those who have experienced similar ordeals, and in the estimation of Mendez, such a period can entail irrevocable damage, with even 24 hours of isolation stretching into an eon. This position was borne out by Rick Ramish, who is head of the Colorado Department of Corrections. Ramish described his experience of just 20 hours of solitary confinement in the New York Times, relating, quote, "Eventually I broke a promise to myself and asked an officer what time it was. 11:10 a.m. I felt as if I'd been there for days. I sat with my mind. How long would it take before ADSEG, which is the term for solitary confinement, chipped that away? I don't know, but I'm confident that it would be a battle I would lose." And so, again, horrifically, what Ramish describes entails the deterioration of his perception of time while in solitary confinement for less than 24 hours. And that is extremely significant because there are these specific effects of solitary confinement that seem to manifest in the people who have gone through it. And again, like what Ramish was describing, where he couldn't tell how much time had passed, that's literally less than a day for his perception of time to become distorted. So, this effect is apparent when Ramish, as I said, recounts asking the guard for the time, despite having promised himself not to do so. So, it tells you that he doesn't know what the time is, obviously, but that he's having trouble estimating how much time has passed as well. So that the head of the Colorado Department of Corrections would experience not only the distortion of time, but also the awareness of an impending loss of sanity within such a brief time span is particularly ominous. And Ramish's account corroborates Mendez's position, which I discussed earlier, which is cited in Chelsea Manning's opinion piece, that even as little as 2 weeks of isolation can cause serious damage. Contextually, this illustrates the exponentially growing risk of permanent mental disfigurement every day that Assange remains thus confined, requiring the utmost urgency of efforts to lift this looming, suffocating silence. Even the Washington Washington Post has characterized solitary confinement as a method of torture, saying, quote, "We would call it solitary confinement. It would also be accurate to call it torture. And enforced isolation is not the only torture in the opinions of those who have experienced it. The practice has also been labeled as such by the UN, with the previously cited Rick Ramish writing in the New York Times regarding his participation with the State Department and other United Nations countries in, quote, modernizing international standards for the treatment of prisoners, now known as the Nelson Mandela Rules." Ramish related that it was decided that keeping someone for more than 15 days in solitary confinement was torture, and in essence, under these rules, the length of time for which Julian Assange has been cut off from the outside world, almost 3 weeks at the time of writing, would now be officially considered torture by the United Nations. And now it has been even longer since this piece was written, and so we have, Assange has absolutely surpassed the amount of time in solitary confinement that would be considered torture officially by the United Nations. And what are these long-lasting and brutal effects from total isolation? In addition to Ramish's experience of time distortion, Business Insider described the profound disintegration of prisoners' vision and sense of direction. And these are specific and important. In each case, they are very much something that manifests very specifically. These are not general symptoms. So they said, quote, "One former inmate in Louisiana who had spent 29 years conservatively 232,870 hours also spoke. He explained that the experience left him nearly blind and with almost no sense of direction, saying, quote, "I could not make a face out 6 feet in front of me, even my brother or mother," Robert King said. And he also said, "If I'm around one corner of my house, by the time I get to the next corner, I'm lost. I'm embarrassed." And that's the end of the quote from Robert King, who was quoted in Business Insider describing his experience. And in other words, complete separation from social contact horrendously and permanently disfigures the brain. And Business Insider chronicled the horrific consequences of inhabiting a total social void. And they described it as, quote, "sufficient enough to change the brain and change it dramatically, whether it is brief or extended." And when I say extended, I mean days, not decades. And the New Yorker also described the severe effects of solitary confinement on former hostage Terry Anderson, saying, quote, he felt himself disintegrating. It was as if his brain were grinding down. A month into his confinement, he recalled in his memoir, quote, "The mind is a blank. Jesus, I always thought I was smart. Where are all the things I learned, the books I read, the poems I memorized? There's nothing there, just a formless, gray, black misery. My mind's gone dead. God help me." Those are the words from Anderson, Terry Anderson, who again was a hostage who was placed in solitary confinement by his captors and who was quoted in the New Yorker. So in light of these wide-ranging reports, the unspeakable experiences of those in solitary confinement are remarkably similar, regardless of whether they are isolated as a prisoner in the US or in the hideouts of terrorists, or in Assange's case, in the confines of the Ecuadorian embassy. A slow internal death, as described by former prisoners and hostages, constitutes the same outcome we can expect for Julian Assange in the absence of swift remediation of his situation. That one of the world's most courageous and brilliant minds could so rot into a formless grey-black misery is unacceptable. And the New Yorker additionally describes studies showing the physicality of injury sustained by those who undergo extreme isolation, writing that a 1992 study of 57 prisoners of war released after an average of 6 months in detention camps in the former Yugoslavia were examined using EEG-like tests, and the results revealed brain abnormalities in those who underwent solitary confinement equivalent to a significant head injury. The article also related, quote, "Without sustained social interaction, the human brain may become as impaired as one that has incurred a traumatic injury. Whether in Walpole or Beirut or Hanoi, all human beings experience isolation as torture." And so again, that's the end of the quote from the New Yorker. But I want to emphasize there that that's the whole thrust of this article, is that it doesn't matter how strong you are, it doesn't matter what your personality is, everyone experiences solitary confinement as torture. I think that one reason that pushback came in response to this article ties into the fact that we still view the mental illnesses, and I'm not comparing solitary confinement to mental illness, but we still look at disorders and injuries and mental illness of the mind and emotions as something that only occurs when you're weak, or it only occurs if you let it, or it only occurs if there's something wrong with you and you're not strong enough, and that you should just be strong enough to endure whatever pain and suffering. And so I think by applying that mentality to what I'm saying about solitary confinement, you misunderstand the point of this, which is that this is as much universal as a physical form of torture. If I came up to you and sawed your arm off, would you expect yourself to not feel pain because you're a strong personality? Or would you expect somebody else to not feel pain because they're a strong personality? No, you'd say that's absurd because anybody who gets their arm cut off is going to hurt. Well, it's the same thing with solitary confinement. Anybody put in this situation will suffer horribly and horrendously, just as much as a physical form of torture would. And from the research I did, a lot of inmates and former survivors of solitary confinement said that this form of torture was more painful than a physical form of torture, because the physical pain could in some ways be distracting from the entire situation, whereas in solitary confinement there is no escape whatsoever. And so that is why it is so important to take this situation very seriously and to recognize that the longer that there is not a resolution to this situation, the worse it is for Assange, and that this is not some sort of middle ground between, asylum and being kicked out of the embassy and taken to a black site and God knows what happening. This is currently a situation which is torturing Assange. This is currently an outcome which is unacceptable and which must be remediated as soon as possible. So with that rant out of the way, I don't know that I'll include it all in the in this film. Maybe I won't, maybe I will, I don't know. But with that rant out of the way, I would like to just continue reading because I think that there were definitely some misinterpretations of what I'm saying in this article and in the universal nature of the injury that takes place when anyone is put in solitary confinement. So, the New Yorker also chronicled the psychosis that was induced in prisoners in solitary confinement, saying, quote, "Soon he was having panic attacks, screaming for help. He hallucinated that the colors on the walls were changing. He became enraged by routine noises, and after a year or so, he was hearing voices on the television talking directly to him." Assange's medical reports have already indicated that some cognitive effects were manifesting years before being separated from the outside world. Thanks to Susie Dawson's work, Being Julian Assange, we know that Julian was already experiencing vision issues, distortion of his perception of time, and other issues thanks to the more than 5 years at that time spent in the embassy and in the heavily confined space of the embassy without access to natural light and varied distances. And these specific changes were identical to Business Insider's depiction of a Louisiana prisoner who left complete isolation, virtually blind, as well as Rick Ramish's self-report of time distortion in less than 24 hours of the cessation of all social contact. And Dawson wrote of medical reports, records made public by Wikileaks, saying, quote, "It is obvious to any viewer that his vision has been affected." She also noted the findings of Assange's medical assessment, which stated, quote, "There is clinical evidence to suggest that Mr. Assange is suffering from significant alteration in his sense of time. His sense of time, space, and internal perception of his body in relationship to the external environment. These changes are all consistent with the restrictions associated with his current living situation." And that is the end of the quote. But again, Wikileaks' publication of a medical assessment of Assange specifically describes his distorted vision as more than simple deterioration of sight, but also on Assange's mental perception of what he was viewing. And I also want to return to that previous paragraph where the medical records spoke about not only the distortion of his sense of time, but also space and his body in relationship with the external environment. That is incredibly important because that's exactly what we saw in the descriptions of effects of solitary confinement in these other prisoners and terrorist hostages. So, Another quote from the medical assessment of Assange that was carried out in 2015. It said, quote, "When I first visited the embassy," and this is the doctor, from the doctor's point of view, the doctor said, quote, "When I first visited the embassy, I noted the cluttered state of what he referred to, and he being Assange, what Assange referred to as his working space. I commented on the clutter and asked, couldn't he see it? He, Assange, replied that he ceased to see things in that way, that it all became a blur in the total absence of any novel sensory input. He described it as a shutting down of his visual field in relation to his physical environment. Interviewees commented on normal aspects of sensory experience, for example, a breeze in the air, as being exceptional events to be experienced rarely within the embassy." And that is incredibly sad, but that is the end of the statement from his doctor. And the point there is that when Assange says that he ceases to see things in that way, it's about the perception that he's getting of his surroundings. It's not just about not being able to physically see, but it's about his ability to perceive what he's seeing correctly. So again, I'll continue reading, but this haunting sentiment echoes the experience of those who shut down in solitary confinement, sometimes entering semi-catatonic states. And although Assange's deteriorating vision can relate to his inability to view changing surroundings, it also relates to his relatively constant isolation over the past 5 years, representing yet another effect of isolation which was manifesting before his connection to the outside world was finally severed. And these issues were specifically cited in the legal proceedings during the unsuccessful bid to gain Julian's freedom through the UK courts recently. And the amazing Stephanie Marizzi, an amazing Italian journalist, has provided us through her litigation for a lot of documents relating to Assange's case. You know, we have a lot of new information about that, which we never would have been able to read if it wasn't for her work. But that's a side note, but it's still important to note. But anyway, continuing on with the article, it is well worth repeating that the breakdown of Julian Assange's sense of time, space, and his own body were all observed long before he was utterly separated from human contact, save legal representatives. What will be the result of this new additional blow? We cannot afford to wait and see. And so I'll say it again. I think it really deserves repeating that, all of the things that I just described from Assange's medical reports were described in 2015 long before this solitary confinement was put into place. And, years ago. So you add a couple of years of time, and now you add a month of solitary confinement, and it's absolutely horrendous to imagine the effect that type of torture must be having on him. And I'm not the only one as well. And the other additional thing to add to this discussion in general is that I'm definitely not the only person to describe the solitary confinement of Julian Assange as torture. Pamela Anderson has also described it in those specific terms, using the word torture, and his doctors also, or some doctors who were able to see him, also described the physical impact that confinement in the embassy is having on him. So there are a whole lot of factors going on right now that make what Ecuador is doing to Assange in this moment, as they are confining him, absolutely horrendous, and something that we just cannot allow to continue without challenging. So the manner of death that will be visited on Assange, if his insulation from human contact proves permanent, is in some ways crueler than an external attempt to harm him. Instead of challenging the sovereignty of the Ecuadorian embassy in a full-scale assault or kidnapping attempt, this slow torture will achieve the same end by transforming Julian Assange's place of refuge into a site of torment. The embassy walls that have thus far protected him, even at a detriment to his health, now represent the walls of a tomb as his mind is slowly rent in the absence of fellow human beings. The Ecuadorian government has long been a subject of praise for its unique bravery in protecting Julian Assange from the most powerful and destructive military interests on earth. To see them pivot so dramatically just months after providing Julian Assange diplomatic immunity is particularly troubling. Assange's situation seemed to be optimistic earlier this year, with Disobedient Media previously noting that the government of Ecuador had confirmed citizenship and diplomatic immunity onto him. If Western interests had been willing to respect international law, a matter which the recent attacks by the US, UK, and France on Syria strongly contradict, Julian Assange would have been able to safely leave the embassy this year without fear of arrest or reprisal. However, this was not the case. In a bleak turn of events, Ecuador's President Lenin Moreno silenced Assange almost 3 weeks ago, which at the time of filming is almost a month ago, for reasons which are no doubt multifaceted, but which, at least in part, seems to have stemmed from the enormous pressure of the US and UK on Ecuador to portray Assange. Disobedient Media recently reported on the possibility that Assange was cut off from the outside world in order to prevent him speaking out against heightened US aggression towards Syria. And I just published an article today at the time of making this video about the fact that Ecuador seems to have struck a deal with the US military to have an increased presence for the US military to have an increased presence in Ecuador, probably. And so, but the point of that is that the article that I published today on that subject, in my mind, indicates that we still don't know exactly what led to Julian Assange's contact with the outside world being cut off, but it definitely seems to be part of a policy that Ecuador is pursuing, where they are trying to make a friendlier relationship with the US, and so it is very, very concerning to see that happen and to then extrapolate that to what could happen in the future. So I just wanted to add that because it's something that had happened since I published this article. So, the severely damaged vision described in Assange's medical records prior to his latest deprivation from all human contact, save his legal representatives, has also been recounted by those who have experienced isolation for long periods, as we've discussed throughout this article. But in effect, Ecuador's decision to deepen the already arbitrary confinement of Assange into solitary confinement is an implementation of ongoing torture and cognitive harm perpetrated against one of its own citizens. And Assange's isolation also shares an essential commonality with infamous cases like that of Khalif Browder. Both were unfairly imprisoned and experienced social isolation while detained without conviction. As a result, Browder ultimately endured 2 years of solitary confinement in Rikers prison while still a teenager. And the Wikileaks founder, his case is unique in that it is not the product of a hopelessly barbaric and systemically racist prison system, nor does it arise from the unpredictable acts of a terrorist group seeking hostages for the sake of leverage. Instead, the torture of Assange results directly from an international decision. Instead, the torture of Assange results directly from an intentional decision on the part of his own government. His devolution into inevitable insanity is not an accidental byproduct of confinement, but the clear end goal of military interests and states that wish him harm. And if the West is allowed to slowly kill Julian Assange in this manner, the global public will have lost one of its most stalwart protectors from the wrongs of government, and that is a loss which is utterly irreplaceable. And that is the end of the article. It's a really, really important article, not just because of the fact that it's dealing with such a heavy subject, but because this is such an urgent situation. And so I will link all of the relevant, sites that you should visit to support Assange, to support WikiLeaks, to sign petitions, and all of that. And if you want to follow me on Twitter, I am at Elizabeth, Leavos. If you want to follow Disobedient Media on Twitter, it's at Disobedient News, and I'll list those links in the description of this video too. And I'm sorry to end it on such a heavy note, and I appreciate everyone that has watched this video and has listened through this to this article, despite the heaviness of the subject material, because it is a really important issue. But I guess I'll just have to leave it there. I hope that we see some sort of light at the end of the tunnel with this situation, but it really, honestly, it does not look good right now, and so everyone has to take it on themselves to personally act on this. And I've said this on Twitter, but I'll say it again here, and that is that it doesn't matter what your skill is or what tool set you have or whatever. Every single person is capable and is needed in making a difference with this effort. And what I mean by that is that, you know, maybe you're musical, or maybe you have a lot of money available, in which case you should donate. But, you know, if you're musical, then you can write a song, or you can, you know, cover a song, or do some sort of musical, create something musical that carries the message of this effort. If you're a painter, you can paint something about this. If you are great at social networking and you have a huge, you know, either huge friends, you know, a great social network, or if you have really good networking skills, then you can put together a vigil, a march, a protest, or something to help Julian Assange and to help in the whole Reconnect Julian effort. If you are somebody who can write, then write something. If you are somebody who is a great public speaker, then go do that. But whatever your tool is or your skill is, you need to be creative and start employing it for this effort. So if you're somebody that is in independent media and has a huge following, make a video about this. If you're somebody that, you know, even, like, I'm trying to think of obscure stuff. So somebody brought up, like, what if I can bake? And I literally responded, in all seriousness, host a bake sale. You know, if you're somebody who, you know, wherever you work, throw some signs up if you're allowed to for Reconnect Julian. I mean, just literally be as creative as you possibly can with whatever skills and talents that you have, and re-engineer them, rework them into something that can be utilized by the Reconnect Julian effort. And I can't really think of any other obscure talents, but you know, whatever yours is, please think about how you can use it for the Reconnect Julian efforts, as I've said like 5 times now. So, but anyway, I'll let you guys go. Thank you so much for listening, and I really hope that we see a good outcome in this situation. And I will see you next time. Bye, guys.